The war in Ukraine is heading into its fourth year, and both sides are pulling out all the stops. Every inch of territory has become a battleground as Ukraine and Russia push for tactical, strategic, and technological dominance. But let's take a step back. When Russia's so-called special military operation began, Ukraine's military was dwarfed by Russia's in size and power. Russia was widely believed to have the second strongest military in the world, and most analysts thought Ukraine wouldn't last more than a few weeks. Yet, here we are. Not only has Ukraine held its ground, but it's managed to repel Russia's advances and even mount counteroffensives that have shocked the world. How did this happen? How did Ukraine, the underdog, manage to go toe-to-toe with a global superpower? In this video, we'll take you through the early days of the war, the critical tactics and strategies that helped Ukraine survive, and the advancements that have turned the tide. But first, let's look at just how vast the military disparity was when the war began. A CNN report dated February 25, 2022, has some of the closest approximations of Russia and Ukraine's military strength at the time. Russia's active manpower was estimated to contain around 900,000 soldiers, compared to Ukraine's 196,000, giving it roughly 4.5 times the manpower to use in the oncoming conflict. Perhaps the greatest manpower disparity lay in the air forces, where Russia outnumbered Ukraine roughly 5-1, at 165,000 to 35,000 total personnel. Notably, Russia didn't, and couldn't, amass all of its forces to enter Ukraine at the start of the invasion. Instead, the report suggested that there were between 160 and 200,000 soldiers out of the country's 300,000-strong land force used for the invasion. On the other side of the conflict, Ukraine fielded around 120,000 infantry. Essentially, while Ukraine was severely on the back foot at the start of the war, Russia didn't actually go all out as had frequently been suggested it would do so. Part of this was due to logistics and history. Simply put, a part of Russia's military is comprised of mandatory conscripts, i.e. troops that are drafted at regular intervals to serve for shorter periods than contracted troops. By precedent, conscripts can't be deployed outside of Russian territory, something that came as a consequence of the previous Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, where Soviet casualties rose to around 670,000 over 10 years. After the war ended, the Russian population urged the government to prevent future deployment abroad, which seemed to have taken root. Even Putin seems to heed this precedent despite the country's woeful record in the ongoing conflict. But perhaps the biggest part of why Russia didn't bring its entire infantry to Ukraine is more in line with previous tactics and plans. The war in Ukraine could be said to be an escalation and perhaps even a natural progression of a conflict that started over 10 years ago with the Russian annexation of Crimea. And in that event, Russia managed to overtake one of Ukraine's regions with almost no shots fired. Instead, the Russian military performed what was essentially a martial coup, flying elite troops to Sevastopol's airport, surprising the local military and national defenses. Then the Russian military seized control of the local government, replaced the leadership with Russian loyalists, and started a sham referendum that prodded Crimea to join the Russian Federation. In 2014, Russia used the political crisis and civil unrest as the backdrop for the incursion, which helped nullify Ukraine's potential responses and speed up the process. When Russia announced the start of the special military operation in February 2022, Putin tried to repeat the tactic. This time, he'd go for the head of the entire country's government in Kyiv. In Putin's mind, Russia already had a claim on Ukraine both politically and culturally, and the Ukrainian people should have been overjoyed to rejoin the Federation. He believed that the core of the country wouldn't really pose much more than token resistance. Even though many administrations and independent bodies published proposed plans that Russia was gearing up for an invasion, Putin believed that a forewarning would only make Ukraine move a bulk of its forces to the contested Donbas region rather than reinforce Kyiv. He was only partially correct. On the first day of the war, Russia launched a two-pronged attack on Kyiv, with a small contingent of Russian special military forces aboard some 34 helicopters being the first strike team to approach the Ukrainian capital by air. The mission for these 200 to 300 soldiers was to take over the Hostomel airport, the largest airport that served Kyiv, and one with significant capacity to accept military transport. The attack would come from Belarus, or more precisely from Myzyr, which was only an hour or so away from Kyiv by air. At roughly the same time, Russia mounted its land offensive from both Belarus and Russia, trying to push its mechanized units to reach the airport as quickly as possible. The plan turned into a disaster from the get-go. The aerial invasion was practically a non-starter, as the Russian forces took significant losses before they even managed to land near the airport and start fighting to occupy it. The Ukrainian troops barricaded the runway, prevented any aircraft from using it for the initial invasion. The airport's meager anti-air defenses managed to down at least 4 aircraft before the Ukrainians were overwhelmed and were forced to either surrender or fall back. Despite that, the Ukrainians managed to delay the Russian occupation of the airport for a few hours, which was enough time for them to ferry some of their own mechanized forces from the surrounding area. The Russian forces that were supposed to arrive by land were heavily delayed. Putin planned for that contingency by supposedly sending between 1,000 to 5,000 soldiers by aircraft transport. However, the Ukrainian military shelled the runway again, making it completely unusable and forcing the proposed reinforcements to fall back. With an occupied airport that they couldn't use and land troops that encountered far more resistance than expected, the Russian troops couldn't adapt to the new situation. Which brings us to the equipment disparity between Russia and Ukraine and how the latter managed to bypass it. Perhaps the most notable advantage Russia had over Ukraine at the start of the war was its impressive arsenal of vehicles. Russia had around 15,900 armored fighting vehicles compared to Ukraine's 3,300, approximately 10 times the number of military aircraft and roughly 17 times more helicopters. But none of these assets would end up mattering in the long run. While Russia had a significantly larger arsenal of tanks, they were heavily underutilized at the start of the invasion. Russian troops advanced too quickly for their own good at the start of the war, with the military trying to take over Ukraine on practically 3 fronts at once. The tanks were the fastest moving among the military vehicles, as tank squads typically didn't have support vehicles and infantry slowing it down. That would end up being their downfall. Without key anti-air support nearby, Russian tanks could be targeted by Ukrainian artillery and drones, which would turn out to have devastating consequences. The Russian main battle tanks, the T-80 and T-90, trace their lineage back to Soviet designs from the end of World War II. Russian war doctrine emphasized producing tanks that were smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable than their Western counterparts. This design made them harder to hit on the battlefield, but came with compromises in power and survivability when compared to NATO's heavily armored vehicles. To achieve their smaller profile, Russian tanks implemented an autoloader system that eliminated the need for a third crew member. However, this design also created critical vulnerabilities. The autoloader stored ammunition in a ring around the turret, which had areas with minimal armor. Compounding this issue, the tank's smaller size meant additional ammunition was often stored messily throughout the hull and turret, outside heavily armored compartments. This lack of compartmentalization made Russian tanks particularly susceptible to catastrophic explosions. Penetrating ordnance or anti-tank mines, whether striking from above or below, could ignite spare ammo, triggering a chain reaction known as the jack-in-the-box effect. This flaw has persisted across Soviet and Russian tank designs, including the T-90Ms. The T-90M attempts to address this issue with modernized safety features, such as storing most of its spare ammunition in the back of the turret with blowout panels, similar to Western tanks. However, whether these changes effectively counter the design flaws remains a topic of debate. While stymied by the fact that the initial aerial invasion of Kyiv ran contrary to the plan, Russia still maintained a heavy numbers advantage near the Ukrainian capital. However, the Russian military has been making a series of logistical and tactical errors ever since the start of the invasion. First, there was the failed aerial invasion of Hostomel. There was practically no reason to believe that such a bold strategy would actually yield positive results. Putin had already used the same move to occupy Crimea, so repeating it on a larger scale against the same country less than a decade later seemed to be completely out of character for a supposedly calculating ruler who also served in the KGB. In the same vein, the Ukrainian military was once part of the Soviet Union itself. The decapitating strike that was performed in Crimea and attempted in Kyiv was part of the wider Soviet military playbook, as it was already exercised twice before, in Prague and Kabul. Ukrainian officers were taught how to think like the Soviets, so they ostensibly knew about the tactic in one way or another. Furthermore, the Ukrainian military started to receive vital training from NATO forces after 2014, making them much more prepared to fight against an enemy that could exercise some modicum of aerial superiority, such as Russia. Secondly, after the initial invasion attempt was rebuffed, Russia seemed unprepared for the scale of the war it got itself into, despite being the aggressor. The military convoys practically traveled through unoccupied territory to get to the front line, giving the Ukrainian military more than enough opportunity to target them from afar. Worse yet, the convoys seemed dead set on trying to move in a single file, which turned out to be a devastating mistake. If the lead and the rear of the convoy were destroyed, the rest of the vehicles had a much harder time mounting a united defensive front and could be disabled freely. Ukraine managed to take out a convoy that contained 100 vehicles by leveraging this exact strategy, showing just how badly Russia screwed up with its tactical planning. Thirdly, Russia never actually managed to surround Kyiv from all sides. The south of the city remained open to reinforcements, allowing the Ukrainian military to keep a steady supply of ammunition and military equipment flowing in and out of the city. Furthermore, the Ukrainian military could pick off the invading Russians from behind, effectively pincering them against the city. Meanwhile, the area to the north of the city is dominated by the river Dnipro and its tributaries, which were controlled by a series of hydroelectric and irrigation dams. Ukrainians opened several of these dams, drastically changing the landscape around their capital city, with the entryway to the city practically dissected by the river and few entry points remaining to the northwest, where Dnipro's tributaries were flooded. Russia suddenly had a much harder time delivering new supplies to that portion of the front line. Fourthly, the Ukrainians actually had NATO support long before the war officially began. After the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine set about modernizing its military, which also included working closely with NATO to get more modernized equipment. As a part of that, NATO also provided vital military intelligence on Russian movements around Ukraine, which would turn out to be enough to develop an early warning signal for NATO and Ukraine on a possible Russian attack. And while we've discussed at length how Ukraine has received top-notch equipment from NATO during the war, and we'll mention some of those a bit later, the first donations actually started long before February 2022. A statement posted by US and Ukrainian officials in 2018, 4 years before the invasion, included an announcement that the US was supplying anti-tank Javelin systems. In a similar vein, the UK started sending anti-tank NLAWs to Ukraine in January 2022, just a month before the invasion began. This meant that Ukraine was already gearing up to protect its territory and that the subsequent war was probably considered imminent by all parties involved. The Javelins and NLAWs would prove to be as pivotal as Ukrainian tactics, as they could strike Russian military vehicles from afar and create significant pressure on the invading troops. Faced with multiple setbacks, the siege of Kyiv effectively lasted only 1 month and 2 weeks. The Russian military officially retreated on April 8, 2022, and Ukraine claimed that it had liberated the entire north of its territory shortly thereafter. The Russians were forced to reconvene on the Eastern Front in the Donbass area, and they faced a similar set of issues there. With the Ukrainian capital no longer under significant threat, although Russia would continue to use long-range drones and missiles to pelt the city throughout the war, Ukraine could move most of its defenses to the east. The added month and a half of surviving the invasion also allowed NATO to start sending in more equipment. These included a mix of Soviet-era weapons that NATO countries and their allies had in stock, such as modified T-72. Poland, the Netherlands, Denmark, the US, and the Czech Republic donated around 470 overhauled or modified tanks, which Ukraine already had experience working with. More modern weapons, such as newer artillery designs, would prove to be similarly devastating in the Donbass region. Effectively, NATO countries started using the war in Ukraine to test their newer weapons in real-life scenarios. Despite the Russian military failing to create innovative strategies, it still had some of the most modern pieces of military equipment around. This would give NATO actual metrics to work with when designing and improving their arsenals. One example of donated equipment that started to turn the tide actually came in an area in which Ukraine had a definitive disadvantage throughout the war: artillery. Russia is the world's largest producer of both artillery batteries, towed howitzers and self-propelled artillery alike, and artillery rounds, outproducing the entirety of NATO threefold. This meant that it could use quantity-based tactics to create significant pressure and push into Ukraine. France was the one to deliver one of the biggest counters to this strategy, at least during the first months of the war. The Caesar is a French truck-mounted 155mm howitzer equipped with an Advanced Fire Control System, or FCS. It can fire 6 rounds in under 2 minutes before rapidly relocating for safety, although it can remain in position if necessary. With a total capacity of 18 onboard rounds, the Caesar offers exceptional agility and survivability on the battlefield. With the truck using a 6x6 or 8x8 wheeled chassis, the entire system is faster, more maneuverable, and impact-resistant than a tracked howitzer, like the ones used by the US and Russia. Furthermore, the digital FCS, the rapid fire rate, and fast deployment and redeployment times allow the Caesar to practically zip in and out of the battlefield. The artillery can arrive at its destination, find its targets, launch rounds, and then be on its way in mere minutes. Add to this the fact that the Caesar has a maximum range of around 25 miles, far more than Soviet-era weapons, and you get a threat that is near the top of its class. This would prevent Russian forces from being able to mount a counterattack by triangulating the source of the fire. The range advantage of the Caesar would be overshadowed by the introduction of ramjet-assisted artillery, which has a theoretical range nearing 100 miles. While Germany and Boeing are advancing ramjet-powered designs, the 155mm shells currently being provided to Ukraine by Rheinmetall have a range of around 100 kilometers or 62 miles and do not include ramjet technology. However, these extended-range shells still offer a significant boost to Ukraine's artillery capabilities, bringing them closer to traditional missiles like ATACMS in terms of reach. Caesar's track record would drill in the 2 pillars of modern warfare: range and mobility. So long as Ukraine could leverage weapons that either outranged or outmaneuvered Russian counterparts, they could stay one step ahead. But there was a third important factor that allowed Ukraine to pull ahead: economics. Ukraine had received more than $250 billion in donations from NATO, whether in direct financial aid or military equipment and ammunition, as well as humanitarian assistance. It allowed the country to funnel its efforts elsewhere and still keep up with Russia's spending, which was about $140 billion in 2024. More importantly, Ukraine managed to make more effective yet cheaper weapons – drones. The war in Ukraine has seen a proliferation of small drones, such as those for recreation and filming, for military purposes. The basic drone could cost at most a few $1,000s, and the larger agricultural drones, which have a higher carrying capacity suitable for mounting anti-tank mines, better ordnance or more drones, have a cost ranging into the area of tens of thousands. When combined with the dirt-cheap grenades and anti-tank bombs that were nevertheless effective against vehicles and infantry alike, a single drone usually costs far less than the thing or person it targeted. To make matters worse for Russia, it doesn't have many counters for this type of warfare. Jamming techniques led to a technological arms race between the two countries, in which systems would clash against one another and get redeveloped month after month. Russia could only use dedicated anti-air systems, which cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per missile to strike down a drone. With that, Ukraine launching waves of drones started putting serious dents in Russian military equipment and budgeting. A $10,000 drone destroying a $500,000 tank or getting taken out by a $100,000 missile was always going to be worth the effort for Ukraine, even if they ended up losing 10 drones for each hit. Drone warfare was also how Ukraine has managed to retake control over its coast. The Russian Black Sea Fleet was forced to stop its blockade of the port of Odessa in November 2023 after numerous Ukrainian drone and long-range missile strikes on ships and refueling ports in Crimea. Ukraine also prototyped and deployed the world's first sea kamikaze drone, one designed to swim to its target. The nighttime raids on ships took out the fleet's flagship and destroyed many others. Freeing up sea access would allow Ukraine to revitalize its exports, as it's one of the world's largest exporters of grain. The sea trade returning to its pre-war levels just a year into the war showcased just how little pressure Russia could put on a country that had no navy to speak of. Finally, there's the matter of the aerial advantage Russia supposedly has. In truth, Russia has never really managed to exert air superiority over Ukraine. The air forces conduct most of their missions close to Russian borders, never straying too far out of Russian airspace. This was because NATO has managed to supply Ukraine with a multi-layered anti-air system throughout the country. It's used Patriot batteries and missiles, drones, man-portable launchers, and various surface-to-air missile systems to disable enemy radars, scramble targeting systems, or shoot down drones. Protected by a wide-spreading shield, the engagement range for Russian forces is typically far below the maximum range of each of its constituent parts. And with Russia being the aggressor, every piece of equipment will be under constant threat, as Ukraine can combine its anti-air systems with aircraft and drones to add yet another layer of defense. With a surprising lack of foresight and an over-reliance on systems that haven't stood the test of time, it's fairer to say that Russia is performing so badly due to its own lack of innovation in military tactics. And the situation hasn't really improved for Russia since the start of the war. NATO has started sending more modern equipment with every new donation package, and Ukraine has managed to create an actual drone-making industry. Meanwhile, Russia's casualties are mounting to the point where it has to use North Korean soldiers to boost its numbers. It's a sign that the end of the war might be on the horizon. But what do you think? Will Ukraine manage to fully repel Russia? Thanks for watching, and leave your comments below. Now go and check out the true reason why Russia started the war in Ukraine, finally revealed. Or click this other video instead.